Hi, I'm Ethan Anderson, and today we're going to be talking about New South Wales public school suspension policy. Now, this is quite a vast subject area with a lot of well-researched issues, but today I hope to shed some light on what I feel is the issue which we most desperately need to see change occur. So, we know that over the last decade, the use of suspensions has been steadily increasing, but there's a general consensus in literature that this needs to be reversed. Now, why is that? Well, suspensions just aren't effective for the reasons you see here, but often our students who are being suspended are the ones who can least afford to miss out on learning. In the US, suspensions have even been linked to the school to prison pipeline, where students whose actions are criminalized in school are more frequently incarcerated immediately after leaving school. Now, whilst we won't delve into the effectiveness of suspension too much today, the issue I want to discuss is discrimination and the simple, disappointing fact that Aboriginal students are more likely to be suspended than any other student. Now, the policy in question here is the Student Discipline in Public Schools policy. On the whole, I found this policy to reflect some really positive values and principles because it creates a framework within which each individual school community creates their own discipline policy, which must reflect the needs of the community. Now, the Department of Education shows that they agree with Newman in that policy can be too restrictive when there is no room for a code of ethics. Hence, each school's discipline policy is designed to reflect government policy with consideration of situational context and the values of involved parties. However, in matters of suspension, principles are to refer to the suspension and expulsion of public school student procedures document, nestled within the department's discipline policy. It contains zero tolerance policies, taking away trust and ethical decision-making power away from principals and requiring them to suspend students for 1 to 4 weeks for certain indiscretions. There's also increasing severity of misconduct being met with increasing length of suspensions, applying the punitive justice model used in our courts in our schools. And of real concern to me was the repeated and exclusive identification of Aboriginal support staff as the personnel best equipped to assist with student suspensions. Now, this just rang alarm bells for me. And what I want to do is redesign this suspension policy to better align with the professional values reflected in the broader policy. Now, let's have a think about the way this policy portrays disruptive students. Now, I want to point out that the expertise of Aboriginal support staff is truly invaluable in assisting Aboriginal students when they are suspended. But just for a minute, let's imagine we are a new teacher or perhaps a deputy principal familiarizing ourselves with this document for the first time. You first read insistent declarations that suspensions are to be carried out without discrimination, but hang on, in the case where you do have to suspend someone, here are the Aboriginal support staff we recommend. Now, who is being constructed as a typical suspension candidate here? Well, the singling out of Aboriginal support staff in policy constructs a perception that Aboriginal students are more likely to be suspended. So you can understand how such systemic discrimination can lead to a reality which conflicts with our ideas and values. Hence, whilst it's a professional value to treat all students equally, we still see higher rates of suspension in Aboriginal students. And here we can see the sad reality of our suspension policy in action. This is the most recent data available based on the 2020 school year. And on the left, we can see that short suspensions were given to 3.8% of the whole student population, but to 11.5% of enrolled Aboriginal students. And this inequity was also recorded in long suspensions. On the right, we see that of these long suspensions, a majority came from zero tolerance policies, with physical violence being the leading cause. Now, surely looking at reducing these suspensions can help our cause. So let's look at how these impact students regarding citizenship and ethics. Aylward goes to great lengths to describe the importance of schools as places of social justice, where students can shape their society and learn values and morals that produce informed citizens. To exclude Aboriginal students therefore limits their social influence and devalues their citizenship. This all plays into this false construct of students and children as future citizens who can be educated to secure Australia's ideals and economic future. Exclusion of Aboriginal students via suspension thereby prevents their diverse Indigenous values from representation among Australia's future educated citizens. Now, if we think about justice as fairness in distribution of good and bad, we've seen unjust distribution of harsh discipline. However, justice does also dictate that wrongs cannot go without consequence. And we'll be dishonouring non-maleficence by not acknowledging that students in poverty are more affected by suspension, and in cases of household or neighbourhood violence, the environment replaced by school during suspension may only reinforce the violent behaviour that led to the suspension. In devising our alternative plans, we must do our best to honour these principles whilst remembering fidelity and the duty that schools have to provide a safe and inclusive learning environment. Now, if we look overseas, we can see that similar problems do exist. In the United States, African American students are more likely to be suspended than other students. In 2014, this was recognized and there came a call for a systemic reform of discipline in schools, encouraging the abolishment of zero-tolerance policies, preferring non-punitive discipline strategies such as peer mediation and counselling over suspension. New Zealand gives an excellent example of how to help Indigenous students. Some schools have incorporated Maori values and restorative justice, not only in learning but in discipline. Restorative justice views misbehaviour as a violation of a relationship, whether it be with the school or between individuals, and focuses on the strengthening and repair of these relationships. Now, if we want Aboriginal students to have a hope for a better future, we need to blend these strategies, among others, and roll out what Graham calls a systemic, inclusive school reform. Whilst this reform must be vast enough for us to change our prejudices, I suggest two keystones upon which other elements of this reform will lean. The first being saying goodbye to all zero-tolerance policies because they innately discriminate against students from violent or low socioeconomic backgrounds. These will be replaced with ethical decision-making, trusting our principals and educators to exercise practical wisdom, thereby ensuring that each student is treated justly whilst minimizing harm to their well-being and education and maintaining commitment to keep schools safe. The second part is a shift from punitive to restorative justice, and this can incorporate elements of community service and project-based learning with cultural elements to help students think and learn more about their cultural and personal values. Indigenous values would be more strongly incorporated in schools at all levels, so it doesn't feel out of place when applied in guidance counselling and peer mediation. Now, these measures will ensure that whilst facing consequences for disruptive behaviour, students' values and citizenship are recognised and represented in the community. Only when we focus on repairing and strengthening our students' relationships will we see improvement in their learning, behaviour, and well-being.